In the late 1800s and early 1900s, thousands of Japanese immigrated to Hawaii and the western United States. Beginning in the 1860s, Japan was undergoing a period of great change as the country moved from an ancient feudal system to an industrialized economy. In order to finance this change, new taxes were imposed, which placed a great burden on farmers. There was widespread unemployment in the cities, and in rural areas, farmers struggled to provide for large families. Since the firstborn son was customarily the sole inheritor of the family farm, many second sons emigrated in order to seek their fortunes elsewhere. In 1886, the Japanese government passed a law to facilitate such emigration. During this same time, the United States was in a period of booming economic and geographic expansion. Promises of work and wealth enticed laborers to the plantations of Hawaii and the railroads of the western United States. Much of this work had been done by Chinese immigrants until the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act, which barred their entry into this country. Although they were eager to come to the United States, most Japanese immigrants were sojourners, only planning to work until they made enough money to return home prosperous. Consequently, most of these early immigrants were single men. A first-generation immigrant from Japan is called an Issei, which comes from the Japanese word for one.
Most Issei in the United States were so-called birds of passage, in that they were going to make a lot of money in the United States, return back to Japan, and live like, not wealthy people, but well-to-do people. But that didn't happen because they were over here long enough that they felt that, well, maybe it's time to get married.
As the fear of a growing Japanese population began to develop in the U.S., and to address the concern of the Japanese government that there were too few women of marrying age in the U.S., the 1908 Gentlemen's Agreement was enacted, which limited immigration of Japanese males but allowed Japanese women to immigrate under an arranged marriage system. Men sent back to Japan for picture brides arranged by their families in Japan. Often, the man and woman never met in person, but only exchanged pictures of each other. Nevertheless, the couple's marriage was most often a successful partnership of hard work and raising a family.
He got married to my mother by the picture bride system, and so they got married in proxy, and somebody stood in for them over in Japan, and then they awaited their bride-to-be, or their wife-to-be, in either San Francisco, Los Angeles, or Seattle, or any one of the other ports. Some amusing stories about that particular experience, because sometimes these Isseis would submit photographs of their handsome young friends, and they would then go through the marriage procedure and then meet their wife at the port of entry, and the wife would be looking around for the handsome young man in the photograph, and she'd be really surprised that these were either older men or didn't resemble anybody in those pictures at all. So anyway, that's how my mom and dad happened to meet.
As Japanese immigrants came increasingly to be seen as a social and economic threat, more and more restrictive laws were passed. The California Alien Land Law of 1913 prohibited non-citizen Asians from buying and owning property, and Japanese immigrants were not eligible for citizenship. Picture brides were excluded in 1921, and in 1924, the Japanese Exclusion Act cut off all immigration from Japan. As the Issei began to settle, raise families, and establish farms, ranches, and businesses in Sonoma County, community bonds began to develop and cultural institutions were born. Although the Issei were unable to become citizens and own land because of the alien land laws, it was possible to purchase land and put it in the name of their American-born children, or Nisei. The word Nisei is derived from the Japanese word for two. Though they were the first generation born in the United States, they are the second generation to live here. Despite the difficulties of the alien land laws, the Issei increasingly saw America as their home. By the 1930s, the Japanese-American community in western Sonoma County had grown to over 500 people. Many Issei pioneers were itinerant farm workers. They and their families moved around Sonoma County following the apple and hop growing seasons, which were the main crops of the day.
It was kind of a seasonal thing where these families that didn't own property, but they worked on in the different seasons. They'd go to the hops, raise hops until about July, and then from July they move into an apple ranch and dehydrate apples. And when that was over, then around October, November, then they go into pruning trees for several months before they started back into hops. And so the rotation were quite a number of families moved several times a year to the different ranches in Sonoma County.
During these years, many relationships developed between Japanese Americans and the greater community in Sonoma County, and a unique level of interdependence emerged as a result of their shared agricultural, school, and social life. What is surprising is that the relationships which developed between Japanese Americans and their neighbors in Sonoma County was not typical of other communities up and down the West Coast, where there was growing prejudice. For the most part, the community here helped the Japanese American settlers and enabled them to return to the place they called home after World War II. What made Sonoma County so unique?
Well, in the country, like, we depended on each other. Like, a lot of times when you have a big farm and you have chickens to vaccinate and things, people help each other. And, it's just working together and knowing each other. Like in the city, there's too many people. You don't get to know them, So, like, our neighbors too, my brothers were friends, and he used to go over and help them gather eggs so that they could play football, And so you get to be friends from when you're little, so you have the trust in each other. And, so we had a lot of German and Jewish and Portuguese, and we were all mixed, So it wasn't, in the country here, when we don't have a whole bunch of Japanese here and a whole bunch of this and a whole bunch of that, they're all mixed together, so we depend on interdependency.
History did not allow things to continue smoothly, however. An event which is still indelible in the minds of all those who lived during that time was about to take place: the bombing of Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. Most Japanese Americans heard the news on the radio, but since the bombing occurred on a Sunday, some didn't hear about it until Monday morning. There were immediate consequences for Japanese Americans as a result of Japan's military actions.
I was about 12 at the time, and it was kind of interesting, in fact, that I was in 6th grade at the time, and Friday everyone was, Asians, Japanese, everybody was playing without any problem. Monday morning, it's segregated. It's like you just cut a line off, and Caucasians were over here, and the Japanese were over. There's about 4 or 5 of us all in the group. That was it. Well, I myself didn't know about it until I got to school that there was a bombing. And it was, Pearl Harbor being bombed, and it was bombed by the Japanese. It was a rude awakening when we got to school.
Caucasian neighbors and friends were shocked by the sudden changes in their community caused by the attack on Pearl Harbor.
I guess one of my most powerful memories was the Monday, I think it was, that I went back to high school, and I think with malice aforethought, the teachers called roll in every class. And there were a lot of people who didn't answer. And it took us a while to realize why. They all had Japanese names. And all of us felt we'd been kicked in the stomach. At least, I say all of us. I talked to quite a few people, and that was the feeling that, what has happened here?
Within hours of the attack, the FBI made arrests in Japanese communities up and down the West Coast. Most of the arrested men were civic leaders within the Japanese American community. They were taken to Justice Department detention camps scattered throughout the Midwestern United States. The families of those arrested had no idea where their loved ones were being taken, or how long they would be gone, or how to contact them. The memories of these arrests, made here in Sonoma County, remain vivid in the minds of both Issei and Nisei decades later. In the coming weeks, a curfew and travel restrictions were imposed on Japanese Americans, whether alien or American-born citizens. On February 19, 1942, President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which authorized the exclusion of all persons of Japanese descent, whether a citizen or not, from designated areas of Washington, Oregon, and California. Within weeks, families had to sell off all their property and personal belongings and settle their affairs. They were allowed to take only what they could carry and were transported by bus and train to hastily prepared assembly centers until more permanent camps could be built. Many Japanese American residents of Sonoma County did not have to experience the devastating losses that were common in other areas, thanks to the help of neighbors, landlords, and friends in the greater community.
We had to get rid of everything, so we had no beds or anything except a mattress. And our neighbor was Featherson, and him and his wife were very kind, and every morning they would leave fresh milk in a jar on the fence, and we go get it to drink. And so the day that we were leaving, Grandma and my two brothers and my mom and dad and my uncle that lived with us, we all rode in the back of a flatbed to Santa Rosa to board the train to go to Merced. And it was my birthday. So our German neighbor baked a cake. I forget what kind it was. But anyway, we ate it on the train.
In the months following Executive Order 9066, the United States government suspended due process and rounded up more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, banishing them to prison camps in remote desert wastelands. Some of those incarcerated were Issei, first-generation immigrants, but approximately 77,000, or two-thirds, were American citizens of Japanese descent. Initially, they were taken to one of 16 assembly centers, located in racetracks, fairgrounds, and stockyards, mostly in California. For some families, home became a horse stall, like the infamous ones at Tanforan and Santa Anita racetracks. Sonoma County residents were evacuated to an assembly center at the fairgrounds in Merced, where they lived in makeshift conditions from May through October of 1942. The peak population of the Merced Assembly Center was 4,508 people.
To give you a picture of what Merced Assembly looked like, take the Santa Rosa Fairgrounds, okay, the whole fairgrounds, the parking lot and everything, put barbed wire fence completely around the whole, put guard watchtowers every 100 feet, and inside where the parking area was, they built Army barracks in there, and that's where the evacuees, the first evacuees, that's where we lived, in these Army barracks. Army barracks was single wall. There was about 4 sections or so, to a barrack. But they only had 8-foot ceilings, and then the ceiling above, the triangle above, was open, and so you can hear people talking from one end to the other. There was no privacy. They had mess halls, and they had the community bathrooms. And it's quite, I'd like to tell you about the bathrooms. Bathrooms for the men's side were a length of about 20 feet, and they had, urinals, but then they had those, there's no seat covers, but they just had holes cut in there for the, men to use. And above the toilets and everything, there was a great big water tank that was filling up. And when the water tank filled up, it would turn over and splash, and come down and rinse everything out. Okay, it's like the have you seen the Japanese garden? You know, where the water fills up and then it tilts over. Well, that's what it was, but it was on a big scale. Okay. The funny thing about this is that when the fellas knew that the water tank was going to spill, everybody rose up because it washed down. And one of the funniest things was this man, he rose up, his wallet fell out right into the hole. Washed down to the back, and he had a mess trying to get it out. But that's how things were.
Oh, I got to tell you about when we went to the Merced Assembly. The only thing that really struck me was I looked and I thought, oh my gosh, they're all Japanese. You know, they all look like me. And I thought, whoa, I mean, there's no Caucasian except the soldiers around the gate. But that was one of the first impressions I got. I thought, oh my gosh, what are we doing here? They're all Japanese.
By the end of the summer of 1942, 10 internment camps had been built in the remote desert areas of Arizona, Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, California, Idaho, and Arkansas. Internees were then moved from assembly centers to those isolated prison camps and surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards. Like their previous move to the assembly centers, the internees had no idea where they were being taken or how long they would be there. Sonoma County residents were transported by train from the Merced Assembly Center to the internment camp in Granada, Colorado, more commonly known as Amachi. The camp remained in operation from August of 1942 until October of 1945, and at its peak incarcerated 7,318 people.
Amachi, Colorado is in the southeastern corner of Colorado on the Kansas border.
All right. And that was the one that most people from Sonoma County went to?
All of the people in
All
Sonoma
of the people
County.
in Sonoma
So it's unique in that respect that we have a common experience in this community of all going through the same assembly center and through the same relocation center, quotes, relocation center. I call it Americans' concentration camps.
Most inmates were frightened at being treated as though they had committed a crime and were unprepared for the lack of privacy and the harsh desert climate.
They still insisted on us being within the barracks by a certain time. And to ensure that that would happen, they had searchlights on, at that assembly center, and they would play the searchlights across the camp as well as, the machine guns being pointed in. So it was very...
That must have been frightening for a child.
I think it was, very, very frightening because it's the first time I'd seen a real machine gun from the barrel end,
There wasn't much privacy because although the barracks were separated by 8-foot high partitions, there was nothing covering the ceiling. And so you could hear one person yelling maybe clean across the other end of the barrack. And so there wasn't much privacy.
And of course, we coming from the cool coastal climate,
Oh, yeah.
all of a sudden we're thrown into the Central Valley, and it was in May of that year, 1942, and it was just frightfully hot.
For the Issei, internment came at a time when they were working hard to establish homes, families, and careers in Sonoma County. All that was disrupted when they entered camp. A powerful symbol of that disruption was the traditional family dinner, now a thing of the past.
The first meal was cold cuts, and it was just a slab of bologna and a piece of bread and tea, and I don't think we had any milk. But at any rate, it was the first meal that my mom didn't prepare for us. And she was sitting there with tears flowing down her eyes, and we couldn't understand why. But I suppose, as a mother and so forth, you could probably understand her feeling. The second thing that I remember most vividly about the camps is that it was the breaking of the family units. We didn't necessarily have to eat together. And so consequently, when as a teenager, we didn't like what they were serving in that particular mess hall, we disappeared to another mess hall in which they had a better sort of thing on the menu. But consequently, she felt that there was this breaking up of the family unit, and once a week she would go get the food at the mess hall, bring it back to the barracks room, and we'd eat together. But she really felt badly about the fact that we were not sitting down at the table together and consequently breaking bread together.
Life went on. There were deaths, marriages, and births.
My father was a very mild man. He sort of rolled with the punches. And my mom was, I think the sad part of this is, I think it broke her heart, because she passed away at age 51 in camp. And that's pretty young, 51. I'm already 81, that's 30 more years than she, 51. But, you know, I think they were true to America, because I went into the military, and I had a second brother. Oldest brother was he was already in the 442nd, and she didn't object at all when I was drafted.
The internment experience had a different effect on the Nisei, many of whom were too young to really understand what was happening to them. Ironically, many experienced freedom in the sense that they were able to run around and socialize with their peers, but there was also an awareness of the injustice being perpetrated.
I think you're kind of confused as to why you are confined where you are, because normally you would be punished for some wrongdoing, but not knowing that you hadn't done anything wrong. I think you're kind of wondering why you are gathered up into this concentration camp, if you want to call it that.
Right.
And you can't be really carefree when you know that there's guards posted with their guns aimed at you if you did something wrong. So I think you know that life is not normal, even as young as what you might be, you know? Yeah. And I guess the good things where I remember they used to have talent shows, and you know, you make the most of what you get, I guess.
Barbara Bertoli recalls how confusing it was to have her letters to her young friend Margaret censored.
I grew up here in Sebastopol, became a close friend of Margaret at a very early age in grammar school. We went through grammar school together and just had a very nice relationship, and obviously still do to this day. I did communicate with Margaret on a steady basis when she was interned, and had trouble reading most of her mail that was sent to me because it was censored. And that also was very difficult to understand, because I couldn't quite figure out how she could be sending me war secrets. And when I wrote back to her, some of mine was censored as well, and she probably had the same difficulty in understanding why mine were censored, because what would an 11-year-old kid living in Sebastopol be able to send to her that would somehow win or lose the war? And Margaret and I both realized today that we would give anything had we kept those letters. But my dad, at some point in time, decided that maybe this wasn't the best thing for me to be doing. Some of his neighbors, some of his friends said, you know, do you really want your daughter to continue to write to a Japanese American? And my dad finally decided that no, maybe I shouldn't do it any longer. So what I did was go up to a friend's house that was by the grammar school, received Margaret's mail at that address, and I in turn would write to Margaret from that address. To this day, I'm glad that my dad never found out, or I'd probably been in deep trouble, but maybe he did know and didn't let on. But I do treasure Margaret's and my relationship, and I'm very, very happy I made a decision that my dad probably didn't approve of, and probably one of the few times that I ever did anything that he didn't want me to do.
Immediately following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, young Japanese American men were reclassified as enemy aliens and refused enlistment in the military. As the war continued and the need for more enlisted men grew, the government began to solicit enlistments from interned Japanese Americans. While interned in camps, young men were asked to sign a loyalty questionnaire. The two most troublesome questions were number 27, which asked if they were willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States, and number 28, which asked them to swear unqualified allegiance to the United States and defend it against attack. Some Japanese American men refused to enlist unless their parents were freed from imprisonment and insisted that they should be drafted like any other American. These young men, because of their responses to questions 27 and 28, were called the No-No Boys.
I remember getting a questionnaire, okay, that said, would you fight for your country? And if you said no, out you go. You know, you were disloyal. If you said yes, you were in the army. But it was kind of a loaded question to me, and so we really studied and everything. I think my answer at that time was yes, if drafted like any other normal American citizen.
Despite the blatant discrimination and the dissent of the No-No Boys, many young men enlisted in order to demonstrate their loyalty to the country of their birth. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, a unit composed entirely of Japanese American soldiers, became the most decorated unit for its size and length of service in U.S. military history. The 442nd RCT is renowned for their rescue of the Lost Battalion in France, and they helped to liberate the Nazi concentration camp at Dachau. 3 young Nisei from Sonoma County gave their lives during World War II: Leo Kikuchi, Peter Masuoka, and Joe Yasuda. And Manji Memorial Hall in Sebastopol is dedicated to their memory. Other young men from Sonoma County served both in Europe and in the Pacific. Sam Miyano had a strong sense of the irony of his military role while serving in Europe.
And from there was routine occupation life. You go from one city to another doing occupational duty. Mostly it was wherever they had prisoner of war camps. We were doing a lot of guard duty. Here I am on the outside with a rifle. A year earlier, I was on the inside looking out at a soldier with a rifle. So it's just how strange life is. And we would take over, put the trucks on both ends, and then we announced that we're taking over. You have 2 hours to leave your billets, the home, and they could only carry the same experiences we had with whatever they can carry, you bring out. But with the assurance that we would not, and we didn't. We didn't break anything, we didn't take anything. And it was a reoccurrence of my life, 2 years or 3 years, living it again in Germany on the opposite side, opposite way, just telling them they have a couple hours to leave and then take over.
With the end of the war and the closure of the internment camps, it was time for people to rebuild their lives. The hardships and uncertainties of resettlement were many, and it was at this time that the extent to which Sonoma County residents supported their Japanese American neighbors became most clear. Many young adults were able to leave camp before their Issei parents in order to attend colleges and universities in the East. Various religious groups, most prominently the Quakers, helped to sponsor these young people. When the concentration camps finally closed, the War Relocation Authority gave each Japanese American just $25 to start a new life. Many of the Issei were too old to return to a life of farming labor, and relied on the older Nisei children to support them. For those Nisei, plans of attending college and starting careers were disrupted. Young Nisei went off to college or to the military, and the result was a diaspora for the Japanese American community. Sonoma County's story is unique. Much of the Japanese American community returned here from Amachi, Colorado. One explanation for this unique situation is the rural, interdependent nature of the pre-war community. Another explanation is that there were many acts of kindness on the part of individuals in this community for their Japanese American friends and neighbors. There are many amazing stories.
You didn't have to sell any of your furniture, and it was here when you came back?
It was all here. After high school, or during high school, I used to have a little jar when we went to the movies. If we crack $1, there'd be dimes. And I left that in the back of the door, and when we came back, I think $28 or $30, and it was still there, didn't it?
For a young child, returning would be especially difficult. Virginia Masuoka was able to leave Tanforan Assembly Center to return to her Caucasian mother in Sonoma. She was apprehensive about the reception she would receive upon her return.
I told my mom, I want to surprise the class. I really do. So could I go to school early and go stand in the classroom? And then when they come in, she said, okay, if you want. So my brother drove me to the school. We lived, I think it was about close to a mile maybe from the farm. And I was standing in the classroom and I heard the bell ring and I thought, oh gosh, my heart was just pounding. And they started up the stairs, and by the time they got halfway up the stairs, I panicked. I thought, my gosh, what if they don't want me here? I never thought of that any earlier. And I thought, oh my God. And I started to run out the back, the second door. And my girlfriend, Roma, happened to see me, and Jackie, and they yelled, Motts, you're back. They gave me the nickname of Motts from Matsuyama. And they said, Motts is back. And they, instead of going in the front door, they came around and they were grabbing me. And I told my children, if ever, I didn't need a dictionary to define the word friendship. I lived it that day. And I still have these dear friends.
In Sebastopol, a hostel was set up to temporarily house returning families, and there are stories of community members helping to ease the transition.
Our family doctor, Vieira, his wife, they lived right near Annie High School. And so I was invited to go over to their house the first day in school and go from, her daughter and I were in the same grade. And so I went over there, and then there were eight of my former classmates there, and they walked me over to the high school, and then there were a bunch of other ones there. So it was kind of nice. I was the first, Japanese American to come back, and so that really, I really appreciated that. But Mrs. Vieira invited me, and so we all walked together.
So all your friends that you knew previously were still your friends and helped you make the transition?
Right, yeah. I was very fortunate that way because they all supported me. And then the principal, Mr. Overman, he was the principal that knew my brothers. And then most of the high school teachers all knew my brothers. So that all helped.
One of the most remarkable stories centers on the attempts to vandalize the historic Enmanji Buddhist temple in Sebastopol.
It was not a large group. There were probably about 8 of us, and we decided that we would come out and try to guard it. So I can remember coming out here and but forming a circle, a symbolic circle around the temple, and dedicating ourselves to protecting it. When we came, there was a chain link fence all the way around it, and big heavy chain on the door, and padlocks hanging down, and weeds growing up in the along the chain link fence, and it just made me feel so sad that this beautiful building, was neglected because the people weren't here who ordinarily took care of it. But we came every weekend in 2-hour shifts for several months, and this was just before the people returned. And then, I'm not sure of the time, but I think it was about 3 months when they began coming back, and so then we didn't guard it anymore. And I don't know that we prevented it from being burned down, because there were a lot of times when we weren't here, but the fact is it didn't get burned down, so we felt successful and like we had done what we set out to do.
Once they returned, Japanese American families put all their energies into starting over.
After we came back, we had to start from scratch like every other family. And I don't think they even had time to think about it, because they never said anything. They were too busy getting back on their feet. And so I never heard a negative or a positive remark about it. I know that one time they said, well, this is kind of our way of doing our part, for the war. And that was it. So, I just assumed, they were too busy. Scratching out a living.
In 1952, when it became legal for Japanese Americans to become citizens, they were eager to make the United States their official homeland. It took over 40 years for the United States to come to terms with the injustice done to Japanese Americans during World War II. For many years, Japanese Americans were struggling to rebuild their lives and didn't seek compensation for the loss of their civil liberties. But beginning in the 1970s, the Japanese American Citizens League began the push for reparation. A key event in the success of the redress movement was the congressional authorization of the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment, which conducted 20 days of hearings in 9 cities. Their 1983 report, Personal Justice Denied, found that racism, war hysteria, and failed political leadership, and not military necessity, led to the evacuation and internment. The testimony during the hearings also ended the silence about the internment experience. For some Issei and Nisei, it was their first opportunity to speak about their experiences. Still, it took another 5 years for Congress to pass redress legislation. During that time, 3 important court cases heightened public awareness of the internment experience. The cases of 3 men who defied curfew and evacuation orders, Minoru Yasui, Gordon Hirobayashi, and Fred Korematsu, originally came before the Supreme Court in the mid-1940s. In each case, the court upheld their convictions, citing military necessity. However, in the case of Korematsu versus the United States, there were dissenting opinions which questioned the constitutionality of the government's actions. In 1983, the 3 men had their cases reopened under a petition for writ of error coram nobis. The decision in the Korematsu case was successfully erased from the record books. After years of effort, on August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act of 1988, which gave monetary compensation to surviving Japanese Americans. More importantly, it granted a national apology clearing the record of any wrongdoing by Japanese Americans, and included an educational component so that the internment would not be forgotten but be a lesson for future generations. The act is important for all United States citizens, a promise that no group will be incarcerated solely on the basis of race, religion, or ethnicity. As Senator Daniel Inouye said at the time, while we individually and as a nation must put the pain and bitter memories behind us, we must not forget them. Rather, this chapter must remain in our collective conscience as a grave reminder of what we are capable of in a time of crisis, and what we must not allow to happen again to any group, regardless of race, religion, or national origin.
I used to talk to Edison Uno, who was my redress chairman when I was national president. He says, Jim, he says, I don't care how much money that they offer me, but the the biggest advantage coming from the redress movement is going to be the educational aspect of it. He said that they can never repay me for the loss of my freedom. And that's what I felt, that the redress movement, the biggest thing coming out of that redress movement is that, the educational aspects. And we're still dealing with that, and we should continually deal with that in the future.
What do you tell your children about camp? Do they ever ask? I'm just wondering about the internment experience.
Not really, not until, I guess it was redress, when we were all working for the redress. And, you know, we shared. But they never came out and asked us, you know, how we felt about being in camp or... And actually, it's the real younger ones that are asking us questions, because now we're going out to the schools and sharing our experiences. And it's what's interesting about that is that the responses we get from the students, I mean, they're just shocked. They don't, they can't imagine this happening in this country.
Many Sansei, third generation, and Yonsei, fourth generation Japanese Americans, grew up not knowing about their parents' and grandparents' experiences during evacuation and internment. Internees did not want to talk about it. They looked upon the experience with shame and felt it was best left in the past. The common attitude was shikata ga nai, meaning it can't be helped. Though school texts gave minimal attention to the subject, some members of the younger generations were initially exposed to their forebears' stories when they studied about World War II in high school.
I didn't hear anything about the internment camp until I had to read Farewell to Manzanar, and that was in, I think, 7th or 8th grade, and it was a teacher of mine, Miss Nealon. She wanted us to all read the book, and I remember she took me aside and she said, you know, you should ask your grandparents about this. I'm sure they were interned. I was like, what do you mean they were interned? This is in LA. This didn't happen. And then I remember going home, when I was reading the book, and I went to my talked to my grandmother, and she really didn't talk too much about it until I think when we discussed it a lot was around the dinner table. It was like a Sunday or something, and we were talking about getting paid back by the government for being interned, and then that's when I realized, like, yeah, this really did happen and so on. But I had no idea what it was about until I read Farewell to Manzanar. I was shocked that it happened to us, or my family.
Japanese Americans of all generations feel that it is crucial to keep the memories of what happened during World War II alive so that history does not repeat itself with any other group.
We should not judge people collectively as a group. We judge them individually and for what they are, and not collectively. And that's the biggest lesson I think we can learn from whatever has happened to us. And we will try to prevent that from ever happening again. But as I say, history has a nasty tendency to repeat itself.
The Giri project is an effort to collect the oral histories of families in the Sonoma County area in order to preserve their unique stories for future generations. It is an important legacy for both the participants and those students of history who understand that knowing our past helps us guide our future.